The title of my talk is Does Adversity Make Us Wiser? And there is a general consensus in most wisdom traditions from my reading of it, with the exception, I think, of Baltus, actually, that experiencing some form of challenge in one's life is necessary for achieving good character and wisdom. Now, Valerie Tiberius has written about this in her book, The Reflective Life, and I've spoken to her about how different philosophers will talk about challenge or adversity in different ways, and that's something I think we can talk about. But some form of having your character pushed to some extent seems to be necessary for achieving wisdom. Now, given that the title of my talk is Does Adversity Make Us Wiser?, I thought I'd start by showing you some data that's relevant to the topic. So around a year and a half ago, we had invited the whole Wake Forest undergraduate body to take a survey. We had around 1,500 students reply, and we had them list all their lifetime adverse life events using a life events checklist. And for each event, we had them respond as to whether the event was a turning point or an opportunity for wisdom. And this used Elaine Worthington's distinction between the two. Now, a turning point doesn't have to be negative, but there is some research showing that people tend to see opportunities for wisdom as positive and turning points as negative. What we found is experiencing an adverse life event, and here lifetime adversity and current adversity were pretty much interchangeable in the model. So this is the result for current adversity. Predicted both experiencing a turning point and reporting opportunities of wisdom. So adversity, among other things, seems to predict the extent to which you're going to report opportunities of wisdom. What we also found, however, though, when you look at the relationship between the hexaco, so this is the big five plus the honesty, humility, and the propensity to report turning points and wisdom, if you look, let's see if I can get this working, at wisdom, it turns out that extroversion was a significant predictor, and emotionality was a significant predictor for experiencing a turning point. So it turns out that how you construe your life event, seems to play an important role as well. Interestingly, openness to experience, which I'm trying to find here, predicts both propensity for perceiving wisdom and perceiving a turning point. Finally, turning points in wisdom predict well-being in directions you would expect given the relationships we saw for personality. Right? So perceiving turning points is negatively related to well-being, and perceiving wisdom is positively related to well-being. What this shows in my mind is that the extent to which you're going to see adversity as an opportunity for wisdom seems to be driven by your personality, right? Which speaks to our previous talk, which to my mind raises challenges for how we assess the impact of the impact of adversity for the growth of wisdom. So I'm going to talk a little bit about post-traumatic growth. Now, post-traumatic growth is psychological changes that we experience as a result of dealing with adversity that we perceive to be positive. Most research on post-traumatic growth has not used prospective designs. So most studies look at post-traumatic growth after the fact. Right? And I'm not going to belabor this point too much, but we can't trust most of these studies for two reasons. First, they're retrospective and they're self-perceived. So you're asking people, how much do you think you've changed because of the trauma? Now, telling people how much you think you've changed is, imagine if you were asking people to report their depression like that, right? So tell me how much more depressed you've become in the last month, and you took that as a valid depression score. But more than that, you're asking people to report on their process, right? You're asking people, how much do you think you changed because of the trauma? We know that we actually have very little insight into why we change. And that explains why the post-traumatic growth inventory is such a bad predictor of life outcomes. You look at one study, it predicts depression. Another study predicts well-being. Another study predicts anxiety. There's a lot of variability. So a couple of years ago, my former postdoc and I published a paper advocating very strongly that we need to stop using this measure, and we advocated for a personality approach, using the methods of personality psychology to do more rigorous research on post-traumatic growth. And we've done some of this work. So it is true that in many cases, because we don't know when bad things are going to happen to a lot of people, sometimes you can only get to people after the fact, right? And I've done research in with survivors of the Rwanda genocide, with the victims of the civil war in Sri Lanka, with low-income populations who have experienced chronic trauma in the southern United States. Those people have already gone through a lot of trauma. So what can you do with those populations? So this is a study that we did where we got multiple informants, and we looked not only at agreement, but we looked at profile agreement, right? Because we are self-enhancers, right? We always think that we're going to be the best thing since sliced bread, for the most part, right? But it's also true that people can agree not only on the overall ratings on a particular scale, but on the profile of people's traits, right? So if my partner agrees with me on my level of agreeableness relative to my level of openness, relative to my level of neuroticism, that gives you better insight into whether my self-reports have some validity. So we did this study with, so we collected data from Rwanda, Sri Lanka, and the US. This is the US sample. We found evidence for overall profile agreement. And because you can get agreement in part because of normative beliefs about post-traumatic growth, right? So anyone can agree with my assessment because of norms about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So we did a distinctive agreement where we control for the mean. And we found evidence for self-other agreement there. What this tells us is that, thank you, there is some evidence that post-traumatic growth is a real phenomenon. Right? There are a number of problems with profile agreement, with the agreement approach as well, which I'm not going to get to since I have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. Another way of assessing post-traumatic growth is seeing whether people's self-reported change shows up in their real life. This is consistent with the state approach to personality, where if I'm high in extroversion, that means more often than not, my distribution of extroversion relevant states is going to be skewed towards the right in this case. So we developed a daily measure of post-traumatic growth. What we found is that it doesn't relate to the post-traumatic growth inventory at all, with the exception of spirituality. So the next step, what we're planning to do, is to do a longitudinal study using the daily measure, so a longitudinal experience sampling study, and figure out what are the potential moderators where people high in these particular traits would be more likely to experience post-traumatic growth in their daily life. Now, part of the challenge here, and I think many of you are going to be more knowledgeable about this than me, is that there are a number of competing accounts about what wisdom actually is. Right? So some people think that wisdom is something you achieve at the end of life. So this is the developmental perspective on wisdom. The perspective that I'm more amenable to, because I'm a personality psychologist, is Judith's perspective on wisdom as comprising these specific traits. I'm also interested in this idea that post-traumatic growth and wisdom also involves this idea of acceptance. This Paul Wallace's perspective, which is the acquisition of knowledge. And finally, there's Bob's perspective that wisdom involves not just having the right method of coming to a particular perspective, but also acting on it. Now, all these perspectives share commonalities, but I think I've just highlighted what's distinct about them. So, one of the challenges I think that's true for both wisdom research and particularly for post-traumatic growth research is that we're not particularly clear about what constitutes wisdom, but also particularly post-traumatic growth. So this is a list of all the variables that various researchers think constitute post-traumatic growth. It's a long list. Right? So depending on what you care about, you pick the measure you want, which is probably not the best way of doing research. So there are a number of exciting questions to test, but and one question I'm particularly interested in is doing a daily diary study of post-traumatic growth, where you see whether particular traits that constitute wisdom moderate people's profiles. but there needs to be greater theoretical clarity. And Stephen Grimm and I, and my colleague Laura Blackie, are working on a grant that we have where we're hoping to get a group of people together to talk about what post-traumatic growth is, what wisdom is, what is the nature of adversity, what's the distinction between adversity, trauma, adverse events, because in the PTSD literature, right, adverse trauma is defined as one single event, whereas most people live in adverse environments, right? It's chronic, right? How does that factor into our definition of adversity and its relationship to personality change? That was very fast. I hope you understood most of that. I want to thank most of my colleagues who worked on this project. I want to thank especially my former postdoc, Laura Blackie, who's now at the University of Nottingham. And this project was made possible by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation, and now with a grant from the Templeton Religion Trust. Thank you.
I guess my initial question is on the idea that wisdom is a system of knowledge. Virtually throughout the morning, wisdom seems to be treated this way as opposed to a skill, even in the category of a virtue that can be trained. Wisdom seems to be the result of something that's happening that requires almost like athletic training.
Right.
Based on what you've done, what would you say for people who've suffered trauma? What in your investigation, what are some of the things that they did that then led to the wisdom that you found?
So I think part of, so just thinking about your question, right? I think if wisdom is the outcome of some type of training or some type of experience, right, then built into experience is the successful negotiation of challenge, the successful negotiation of failure. And to me, that's different from experience in clinical trauma, from experience in some type of structural disadvantage, right? So with the data I presented, right? So I presented data from low income, mostly African American community participants who had experienced multiple clinical traumas, right? And if we were to do a study that focused on wisdom, I would have to think carefully about, okay, so what would be a suitable target population? And I would also think about what my definition of wisdom would be, right? So if I were to adopt your definition of wisdom, I would think carefully about what type of experiences are these people having, right, that would increase the likelihood that they would attain that wisdom, right? It's not clear to me that, for example, the data from the corroboration study that I presented, right? Maybe some people would have taken those life experiences as some type of valid knowledge that would have led them to wisdom, right? But I think when it comes to studying wisdom, I would need to be clear, right? Just to go back to my last point about what exactly those three components are. So it's not just considering your definition of wisdom; it's considering your definition of wisdom in combination with how it would define the role of what adversity is, how it relates to wisdom, like what is it doing there, right? And whether it's synonymous with post-traumatic growth or whether it's the same thing, right? But another question I didn't touch upon is that with some of these definitions, post-traumatic growth and wisdom seem to be the same construct.
This is really cool stuff, Eranda. I like your presentation. We're very sympathetic to the problems of conceptual overlap, and I think it's also a great segue into our group discussion because you already introduced the key components of trait and state definitions and just research and personality. I just had an idea. I was listening to your talk, and I would just want to know what you think about that. So I'm thinking about immigrants and immigration experiences. And I wonder, like, immigration experience can be very traumatic.
Oh, yeah, right.
I mean, you and I probably know that.
Yeah.
It's not easy, and at the same time, quite a few things that we associate with sort of what you may be able to gain from the immigration are often be kind of related to the notion of wisdom. Many definitions of wisdom, like including openness to new experiences, including different perspectives, including trying to integrate different perspectives together, and so on. Intellectual humility, that you're like just straight into your face, that you don't know anything about this new culture. And I wonder if that would be a very it's just a suggestion, I don't know what you think about it, but like a very fruitful direction to study in terms of, it's a particular type of traumatic experience, but a very interesting paradigm.
I think that would be very interesting. I think one thing that you could add to it that would be very interesting is the context in which the refugees come over. So there's some refugees who come over volitionally, there's some refugees who are forced out of their countries. There's a nice, I forget the name of the author. There's an author who makes a definition between Odyssean and Rubicon refugees. So the refugees who come over and they make a home for themselves in the United States or wherever their host country is. And the other refugees who come, but they always maintain this sort of wanderlust for their home country, and they say, one day I'm going to return, right? So this is a very crude distinction. But there's something about, like, I'm going to come here, I'm going to make it here. Whereas I'm going as opposed to, I'm going to come here, but, my heart's really back there, and I can't really wait to go back, right? But I think that would be really interesting. That's a really interesting idea. Yes?
I think the issues of trait versus state. The issue of trait versus applies equally to resilience. I mean, is resilience a trait? Is it a state? Is it an outcome, or is it a process?
Right.
And the answer is, in a way, it's all of them depending on how you view it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the same thing would apply to post-traumatic growth. I mean, in a way, that's a manifestation of resilience. What do you?
Well, right. So I think, my personal view is that resilience is a response, right? And I also think, and this is, there's some so if you're interested in this, there's some very interesting responses to our target article. One of the challenges of post-traumatic growth is that some people think about it as a process, some people think about it as an outcome. And I think for us to study it more successfully, we need to be clear about what exactly it is, right? What are the outcomes of post-traumatic growth? What behaviors, what beliefs are we looking at? What are the predictors? And just getting some clarity on that, right? So I take your point, because ultimately, yes, all these things are interrelated. But part of the reason why the research this far has been really muddy is that different studies, like, for example, use this scale in different ways, right? As predictors, as outcomes, as moderators, and that doesn't really help clarify our understanding of things.
I was just thinking about your talk in relation to Monica's talk, where you found the importance of post-traumatic growth, and she found the importance of a happy childhood. And that got me thinking about the fact that intelligence is correlated with wisdom, but some very smart people are very foolish, and then they run for political office. And I'm just wondering if the approach, if we need a somewhat different approach, because when there are correlations, there are always so many contextual factors that matter, and you could get in one context you get this correlation, in another context you get that correlation. That applies to my own data too, like the negative correlations we got between our science reasoning measures and SATs. Well, that was a Cornell. It's already restricted for range. But I'm just wondering whether we need a more sort of contextually based approach that takes into account both the context in which you're working and the interaction of a person's personal skills and dispositions with that context, because otherwise we can get correlations all over the place.
So I agree with you. So right now I'm running this, we're running this year-long study where it is a daily diary study, but we are getting data not only on people's trait manifestations, but also on their situational contingencies, right? So when you're enacting a trait, where are you? What are you doing, right? And it's still a rating, but it gives us more data about what situation they're in when they're enacting their behavior. There are some, there are people who work in, the traditions of Diane Adams, right? People who do more narrative work. Kate McLean, in particular, has been doing good work. And actually, this distinction between lessons learned and deriving wisdom was taken originally from her narrative work, right? So she has some work showing that understanding how people find positive outcomes from turning points and what are called C opportunities of wisdom can be understood in these narrative contexts, right? So I completely agree with you. I think ideally, a study that combines both this quantitative approach with narrative data would be very insightful.
Thank you.